Welcome everybody to our monthly Hazardous webinar. My name is Kat Haynes and I am the NHRA Node Manager covering New South Wales, ACT and South Australia. I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting across a range of different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands. I am on Darawal country on the beautiful south coast of New South Wales, just south of Wollongong. First Nations people have long looked after and cared for country as kin and continue to do so today. I'm a guest here on Darawal country, as I am whenever I walk in Australia, and sovereignty has never been ceded. We at NHRA can play a fundamental role in dismantling the ongoing processes of colonisation and supporting Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people on this journey. After all, we all share the same fundamental goal, that of resilient and sustainable landscapes and communities and everything in between. The webinar today is on a project that's been exploring community risk assessment and exploring the processes to understand the challenges and needs across the emergency services sector. Our speaker are Naderpajouh from the Sydney Environment Institute at the University of Sydney, and also Sara Morgan from the New South Wales State Emergency Service. This was a true co-designed project with Nader and Sara, along with others from the research team and also from the New South Wales SES, working very closely together on the project. Sara joined many of the research interviews and really became a research partner rather than a more traditional end user. And this is really what we hope for all our projects at NHRA. And these two have really been our dream team. And I hope you enjoy the webinar today. So we will hear from Nader first and then Sara. And then at the end, we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A. So please pop your questions in the Q&A box and we will answer as many as we can. So I would now like to hand over to Nader. Thank you.
Thanks, Kat. So I would like to start with reiterating the acknowledgement of the country. At the University of Sydney, we are at the land of the Gadigal people of Eora Nation, and we pay our respect to elders, past, present, and emerging. And similar to what you mentioned, I would like to also extend this acknowledgement to the land of the people that have that are joining this presentation. It's a great pleasure, and I would like to thank everybody to take time to join this presentation. And I hope you would take some useful points at the end of the presentation. I would like to start with a confession that before the first time that I was starting to present the preliminary result of this research, I was thinking many people would find this not an interesting and probably a boring research discussion. Community risk assessment is something that we have done forever. It has been studied extensively, and there is no buzzword in the title. And but throughout these presentations, I'm happy to see that this has not been the case, and we had a lot of interesting conversation about the details of the research after that. And I'm happy to continue that in the question and answer session this time. So my name is Naderpajouh. I'm head of a School of Project Management at the Faculty of Engineering at the University of Sydney. And as Kat suggested, I'm representing a very interdisciplinary team. You can see their names here, but probably what you cannot see is a range of interdisciplinary that the research and background that they are presenting, from social sciences to hydrology to different streams of engineering, including humanitarian engineering, health sciences, and also we have law scholar in the team. And as Kat mentioned, again, this has been a very co-design. I'm assuming there has been a process before we got on board and we got selected as the research team. But after that, we had a lot of sessions with Sara and her team, and the research has been co-designed and co-executed. And what you see as a co-presentation today is really a continuation of this collaboration. So after my presentation, which I'm looking at it as a summary of the scientific inquiry that we had throughout this research. Sara will present the practice inquiry and how they have conducted their understanding through this research. And also acknowledging, obviously, Natural Hazard Research Australia that funded this research, and our node manager, Kat, which opened the session. So I would like to use the two classic parallel line of argument to say why, and to see, this is my understanding of why this research is more interesting than what I was expecting at the start. And the classic lines are practice and theory. So in our field data, what we observed was that all the agencies that we have talked to, they're at different stages of moderately or significantly revising their community risk assessment models or practices. So some were at the incubation stage. They were thinking what they want, and they were already aware that the models that they had for us are not completely addressing the needs, especially in the face of climate crisis. And they wanted to envision and rethink what they want, and they were setting the vision and the plan forward for the revision. Apart from these people who were in the incubation period, some were in the process of revising. So they were setting the steps, they were setting the different parts of the model, and some were have just finished their revision of the community risk assessment models. And when we were talking to them, they were at the stage of starting to disseminate and also implement the models that they have been devised. In my observation, when I look at the data is kind of shouting that the time is now. And this is also reflected in theory. Then there are increasing calls for multi-hazard, compound, and cascading scenarios, so considering these complex scenarios. There are also calls for considering diversity of the communities within community risk assessment to include the dynamic nature of the community risk itself, and also to consider vulnerability and resilience within the community risk assessment. So as you can see, a lot of those buzzwords, which were not present on the title of the research, are inherent within the nature of the phenomena under study. So the scope of what this research was to do a synthesis of practice and theory. I'm not going to bore you with the detail of the systematic literature review. Dr. Ali Zolgad was the main force of performing this synthesis. But what might be interesting for you is the outcome and what we are seeing as an output of this synthesis, which is on the paper. They are set of very large tables, multiple page tables. And these tables basically present a range of alternatives of how community risk is defined, how it is conceptualized, and how it is assessed. And in terms of conceptualization, there are different elements that they have been used to conceptualize community risk. Three classic one are hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. So we have also separate data, separate tables that show a range of indicators and the data that is used for these elements and what range of data that are used. So I will show you a snippet of these tables just to get a sense. Again, as I said, these are just part of those extensive tables, but this gives you a sense of what we are talking about. As you can see in the table, we have different ways of ways of defining community risk, and different ways of measuring and conceptualizing the elements that are used. In some cases, they have defined it outside the three classic hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, and we have tables about those as well. And then what is the risk assessment approach? How are these measured in practice? So this general table is, again, as I said, accompanied with other tables for each of these elements. For example, we have a table about the hazards. Again, what indicators are used, what data is used to measure those indicators. Same goes with the exposure, vulnerability, and also other indicators that are used. For example, a set of demographics that are used. I just want to highlight one point here, which is the data that is used. So when we are talking about the revision of the community risk assessment, a lot of times we are focusing, and you will see the guideline that I will discuss about the elements of these community risk assessment, how we practice, and what are the elements that we are using. A major point of these revisions should be also the focus on data, because often when it comes to data, first of all, it's a major limitation because the availability of data would practically dictate what conceptualization and definitions are possible to use. But also, we can envision how we can collect data differently in future. So one of the suggestions that we have is that in addition to envisioning how the agency want to perform community risk assessment, they should use this as an opportunity that how they can collect data, or what other data they need to collect, how differently they can collect the data, so that it would set the foundation for future visions that they would have, and they would not limit themselves with the limitations up to the date. So this is an interesting and important element of this research. So in addition to this synthesis of research and practice, we also did some empirical study of interviewing 29 individuals from a range of agencies across Australia and New Zealand. And we are continuing these interviews. But the combination of these two have provided us not only with those granular set of tables that you saw, but also what are the common approaches that we have in community risk assessment, which are categorized into two major categories. The top-down models are often agency-driven, technical, often quantitative. They are the GIS maps that you might have. They are the simulations that you might have. And the bottom up, on the other hand, are the community, very contextually rich community risk assessment models. Examples of the top down are a statistical, which looks at the historical data and how this historical data is informing us informing our plans for community risk assessment. Simulation-based methods, which use this statistical method to prepare us for different scenarios for future, to inform us what if scenarios that might happen. And index-based, which I would be more than happy to discuss them. They are getting a lot of attention, and it is very important to understand what is the purpose of these index-based approaches, what are the limitations, and where are they effective? Where are they effective to use? Which kind of dictates again how we are going to use them in the future. And in terms of bottom up, there are a range of approaches to basically absorb and get the community knowledge, focus groups, interviews. We can also use mediums such as maps or calendars as a central point of discussion, again, to engage the community and get the necessary knowledge that is important for community risk assessment and the planning of the resources that are coming with them. So the main output of this research is a guideline for development of community risk assessment. An agency, a community, or any entity who wants to develop community risk assessment or wants to revise the community risk assessment can use this guideline. And if I want to present very briefly what this guideline has, I would say it has two sections. A section that would tell you what can be done, what are the potentials, what are the alternatives, and a section that can tell you what should be done. So what are the principles that we need to consider? If I want to unpack it further, the what can be done and alternatives are those sets of tables. So if we want to develop our community risk assessment, we can look at those tables and see what are the range of tools, what are the range of alternatives that we have at hand that we can use to develop our community risk assessment. The inherent message here is that there is no silver bullet. There is no single definition that fits everywhere. We need to be open and take the pluralistic approach to community risk assessment. Sometimes even for one agency, different definitions, different conceptualization might work at different scenarios that they are facing. The other advantages of having this range, this spectrum of possibilities, is that we can innovate. So the agency or the community can look at these alternatives and can say, for example, for my specific context, I can tweak this element a little bit further, and I can go beyond the boundaries of these existing approaches and develop something that really fits the purpose of the scenario that I am facing. So these tables are basically showing what can be done, and the principles are what should be done. So these are based on the visions and the needs that are basically coming from the empirical study that we have. When we are developing a community risk assessment, what should we consider? I'll give you a couple of examples. One is a level of analysis. So where should we focus our plans? Where should we focus our indicators that are informing our plans? This is very important, as it is also relevant to the second example of principle that I'm going to bring, which is considering the diversity of the community. So if for example, I'm using an indicator for this LGA that is the geographical focus of my community risk assessment, what is the diversity within this? If the indicator is just showing the average, how can I plan for the tails of this distribution for the people who are not represented by that average? And one of the examples we had in the interviews was the cases that, for example, in one community, people who were on the hills, basically, which were less prone to flood, were also of higher socioeconomic status, and their needs were very different than the people who were very close to the floodplain, and they tend to have less resources available to them. So the community risk assessment and the planning and resource planning that comes of it should consider such a diversity and inform the plans based on that. So I would like to finish my presentation with what was in my own opinion, the most interesting observation that we had. When I think this is a very known challenge. This is an old age and ubiquitous tension that we always had between the bottom-up and top-down approaches. And I would probably present it through a personal story that I had. In 2019, 2020, I had an interview about the Black Summer bushfire, a community that was impacted because they were on the tourist route and the road was cut. So basically the main income of this community was cut. Regardless of the story, few months after this interview with Canberra Times, accidentally I came across the link to the interview in social media. And I did what most of us might do, and we don't confess probably that we do that. And I went through the comments up and down. Lots of political debate, lots of taking side, lots of effort. My most interesting comment today is somebody simply just saying Dr. effing who, which if you were wondering, they were referring to me. But what I saw in that comment section is exactly what we saw in the data here, that there is a divide between the bottom-up approach and the top-down approach. They are talking different languages and they are not connected. So our bottom-up approach, which is very rich contextual knowledge, which bring you information that can override sometimes the technical knowledge, are sometimes missing in the technical planning. On the other hand, our technical planning, the justification behind those technical models and maps and GIS and simulation models that we have are not clear for the community. So they are not accepting that. And also they are not informed by the community knowledge. Again, one clear example of the importance of such connection is the case that one of the interviews was telling us that the agency went to this community and they naturally went to save all the houses. But the community told them, forget about the houses and go to the factory, to the mill. Because if we have a job, we can rebuild our houses. But without jobs, the community would lose much more than the house. So the priority that the community was giving was very, very different than what the model would and the planning would tell us. So this would be the main path forward for us to see what are the pattern of these divide, what are the strategies to connect these together. And with that, I would finish my presentation and I would hand it over to Sara, which again, as I suggested, would present more of a practice side of it. So how this scientific inquiry from this side was also performed from the practice side, and how has it informed the practices that they are having. So, Sara, the virtual floor is yours.
So good afternoon. My name is Sara Morgan. I'm presenting today on Darkinjung land, which is on the central coast of New South Wales. I am a senior project officer at the New South Wales State Emergency Service, and we were the partner in this research project. I just want to also take this opportunity to recognise the work of Melissa Cooper, who is part of my team, and she was played a key role in this project as well. At New South Wales SES, we are a volunteer-based emergency and rescue service. So we provide assistance to communities across New South Wales 24/7. Our major responsibility is in responding to flood, storm and tsunami, but we also provide a lot of general rescue effort in rural parts of the state. Including some of the less common bits and pieces like animal rescues and vertical rescue, snow or alpine search and rescue, bush search and rescue, road accidents, I missed anything, vertical rescue, and also even as community first responders for some medical incidents in some more isolated communities. So there's quite a wide range of activities and roles and responsibilities that we take on across the state. So my program of work is the application of our capability framework, which was developed about 2 years ago. And we're implementing that through a range of different approaches, including some process change pieces, looking at reporting and some data development, and also risk-based target development for some of our output areas. That's the image of our capability framework, defining our, as you can see, our legislated agency, combat agency roles of tsunami, storm and flood, our core capabilities around the outside, which are our key activities that our volunteers undertake, and then all of those supporting, enabling really capabilities for the outer component, without which none of it is possible. So the overarching vision for this work, this program of work in the bigger picture piece, so not just this research one, but the capability framework program in general, is so that we are naturally aiming to get the right things in the right place at the right time to support the right people to make the right decisions. So in order to create that kind of informed decision-making piece, there's obviously a lot of different elements, with one of the key components being that assessment, or that almost starting point of an initial assessment of risk and impact. And looking at that, not as much from a single hazard view, but trying to take that community perspective. So not, well, how much flooding is going to happen in this particular geographic area, but who is this community? What happens to that community, and how do they respond? What's the effect on them? What's the impact on them? And in what circumstances does that change And so that's where NHRA and Nader and his team at Sydney Uni came in. So as Kat and Nader have both reflected on, this was a really collaborative approach. And so initially we spent a bit of time together working out why we were doing this, what the purpose was, what the key requirements and outputs and components needed to be. And great credit to Nader and his team for being very flexible around those discussions. That then fed into the approach for the literature review, which Nader's already talked about, and the plan and the development of the list of people and agencies and groups and organisations who we wanted to interview. And even better, that became a really iterative process. So we did all of the interviews together, either myself or Mel were part of all of the interviews. And after each one, we reconnected, talked about what had come out of it and adjusted from what we'd learned. And often out of one interview or one discussion, we'd get a connection, another piece of the puzzle, and we'd find somebody else that we needed to talk to who had some experience or some learnings or some advice that we could take further on, which was really valuable. I think for me, particularly, being involved all the way along meant that the direction and the learnings were able to be used to adjust what we were delivering. And I think what it meant is that we got what we needed rather than what we thought we might want at the beginning of the process. So I've been involved in other situations where you kind of have an idea to start with and you ask for something to be delivered, and then when it arrives, you realise that that's not necessarily what it needed to be. And that was the really valuable part about this. While it was a lot more time intensive than just saying to Nader, right, go out and give us the answer, what it did was it meant that we actually were able to mould the work as we went along so that it we were getting what we needed out of it. And also it provided us with a lot of learnings and connections into other agencies, into other people, which are proving really valuable across some other areas of our work as well. So we got a bit of an extra bonus out of that too. What we're now needing to do is probably the big question. So as Nader said, he's talked you through the outputs, the research outputs. So what I was wanting to do is just talk you through an outline, I guess, of what we're doing with it. So this information and our understanding of it has really wide range of applications for us as an agency. My background isn't actually in risk and analysis, so I'm looking at this very much through the New South Wales SES specific capability lens. So for the purposes of this program, we're looking at really practical capability focused outputs. Keep in mind, I'm talking you through this from my very non-technical perspective. We started with that base concept of hazard and risk and vulnerability, really. So if we started off looking at natural hazards, let's say there's a storm. It affects a particular geographic area with certain features. Some of the people in that area will get some rain. They'll get the garden watered. And the rain will also fall in some places where nobody even notices. Some of the people in that area will have some impacts from the storm. They might be in an older house with lower building standards that can't withstand the wind as well. Or it might have older, not poorly sealed windows that let some water in. They might have a tree come down in the garden. A lot of them will be fine and they won't need any help, even if it does have an impact on their home or on their personal circumstances. They might not have much happen to them, or they might actually be able to deal with it on their own. Maybe they can handle their own chainsawing or their own roof tarping or their own mopping up. But there will be a group who do need some assistance. So they might have that tree come through the roof. They might have the water rise so that it's coming under the doors. They might be unsure of what to do, or they might not be able to physically manage the immediate effects. Maybe they don't have the tools or the skills or the capacity to do that. So that's where the New South Wales SES comes in. So as I said before, our legislative role is in responding to issues from flood, storm and tsunami. But actually, we also have a whole other set of support roles. So we have to consider those issues that fall outside that natural hazard space. So we work on over 200 land searches every year that often last for days. So it's a significant load on our volunteers. As I mentioned before, we also respond to major road crash incidents or medical events. We're regularly involved in operations where there's vertical rescues or even animal rescues. There are a whole set of other factors, which I'm calling there the support role impact, that we need to consider. And I've got the other factors that I haven't put on this image that we also want to bring in are, I guess, the future. What does the future look like in terms of change of load and impacts? That looks at data sources like looking at climate change effects, population growth or decline, and particularly land use and development changes have a big influence, particularly on some of those flooding and storm effects that we need to consider. What we then do is look at the fact that the factors that influence the load, as in the amount of these types of jobs that we need to do, and the skills that are required to respond to each of those areas are quite different. So we then need to work out what they are and how to measure and analyse them. And I think that's something that came out really clearly from the interviews that we had, that unfortunately it isn't a one size fits all. There is no golden ratio or algorithm that we can all apply to our own purposes that we're trying to understand these risks and impacts. And it's because it really depends what you're wanting to do with that information and what you're utilising your understanding for. And so rather than having a general overarching risk assessment for an area, we're actually looking at the risk and impact of each of the activities that we might need to do as an agency in order to support that community. So we work on then defining the data that we need. So those data points that I've got in that image are obviously only examples. They're not all of them, and they're some of them are relevant to some of the points and not others. Unfortunately, it's a much longer list than that. We then also need to apply the reality of what we can actually get, what data exists, and what we can use. So in some cases, the data doesn't exist, or it's patchy, or it's only available at a really high level. In some cases, it's internal data, which is something that we can manage more easily. Some places it might be very expensive to actually even access that data or maintain it. So there's all of those things that we need to consider as well, because this needs to be an ongoing piece. This is not a once and done exercise. This is something that we need to be looking at really frequently and reviewing and updating all the time. So from that set of data, we can then create some risk intelligence reporting. So some of that might be just showing the risks or showing that the data outputs, whether that's in terms of numbers and proportions, or whether that's in mapping across the state. And that can be used for all sorts of different purposes. But what, again, it comes down to is that use case scenario. So some of the things we're going to be using it for are creating a unit classification structure and also defining some targets for capability. So that's looking at what do we need to service those communities in different locations. An SES unit is not an SES unit. They are incredibly different depending on where you are and what the needs of that community is. We'll utilise it for operational planning or capability planning. So our operational leaders need to have the information that they can effectively use to understand the area that they're supporting and the challenges that that community, or those communities rather, are facing, and so that they can plan from a resource perspective what they need to support that community. We can utilise that in the development of community profiles, which we do already use to some extent, but we're hoping to be able to enhance that a little further with some of this data. And the community profiles are then useful for all sorts of different purposes in themselves that I'll get to a little later. And we can also use it for public information. So there is some really good opportunity to utilise some of the risk and impact information to help the community understand what might happen in their area and what might happen in response if something goes wrong. So all of that connects together into the tangible outputs and the plans for our teams across the agency. So as you can see from operational planning, you can look at what we need for people, for training, for fleet, for facilities, for equipment, connecting into the community profiles for volunteer recruitment and engagement. Community profiles and public information also then are directly connected into our community engagement and support activities, and then how we message out to the community, whether that's for preparation or response. So once we've managed to get all of that done, which is no small task, the future things that I think we really need to look at is some more formal data analysis to create some more detailed insights. So some very specific use case scenarios. I think we can, we've certainly identified that we can make some improvements in our own internal data sources so that we can rely on them more consistently into the future. And a really key piece, which is what Nader was referring to, is that community consultation. So I think when we started off this work, we were optimistically hoping that we could bring that community consultation in over the short period of time that we had to implement this program of work. And I think realistically, we've realised that that's not going to happen. We're going to start getting the data and the understanding and the utilisation of that right, and work on the processes that we can then bring in that community consultation. We're fortunate in that some of the community consultation already happens because our units reflect our communities to as much as we can get them to, and the units are certainly involved in some of that feedback around our operational activities and our risk planning. But certainly the two big roles that the community can play is helping us to identify the relevant pieces of data and to verify whether that data is effective and whether the risk analysis is actually accurate in their eyes, and particularly that input and advice on prioritisation around activities and around, the mill and the house example is the perfect story around that Nader left us with. So that's me. So I will hand back to Kat and Nader and co.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Nader. So we have lots of questions coming in, so we will move to those. And I think it was one of the first questions that came in. Emergency services are state agencies, yet community risk is local. Why is local government not fully embedded in designing, developing and implementing these programs? And there was another question further on about related to that as well. And I guess over to you, Sarah, what's, I guess, the relationship between the SES and local government around doing these risk assessment processes?
I think so that there are certainly a lot of connections between SES and local government, particularly around flood planning, as far as I understand. And I have to admit that there are people far more able in the agency to answer that question. So we might take that on notice and provide a more full response around that. And I would certainly agree that there's the collaborative approach doesn't just extend to the communities who are affected, but all of the other agencies and organisations who are involved in supporting the communities and responding, both in preparation, well, across the spectrum of preparation, response and recovery, particularly. So I don't know whether the question is coming from a view that it doesn't happen at all or whether it doesn't happen enough. In this particular situation, the outputs of, we're really encouraging the outputs of the work that Nader has created to be very widely available and used. And I know that that's the NHRA's aim, really, to make sure that everything can be accessible. And in terms of the work that we're doing in SES, it's, as I said, the initial pieces around our internal capability focus and I guess what that will do is set us up internally to have that ability to understand our community needs and what we need to support those communities from an SES perspective. But that will also then flow out into the interactions that we have with local governments, so that we can share that knowledge and understanding with them and support their planning pieces.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. So on to the next question that came in from Kim Ferguson. In developing the potential models to review community risk assessments, has consideration been given to cascading or reoccurring disaster frequency? So Nader, over to you for that one.
I just want to segue a little bit from the previous question that was about the community and the state agency. And I want to say one of the observations that we had is that this bottom up and top down, this community and agency, that is there is a existing tension there. So even if an agency does perfectly and works with community, still you can see that there is a source of tension, and there is no perfect practice there. Because these models are different, because the command is different, the needs are different. So there is a lot to study there and observe how these tensions are unfold and how we can improve it forward. But I don't think there is a perfect model, and even in perfect models, I would expect that we would see these tensions. And coming to cascading and reoccurring disasters, so there are multiple ways to consider them. One is that we, for example, let's say we do simulation. We simulate this for different events in a single way, and then we try to integrate the result of these simulation together. The other way is that we consider, for example, the probability of multiple events together. So looking at those tables, we can pick up, for example, the elements of the community risk assessment and see in the literature how they have, for example, suggested if you have a probability of multiple events, that if we go back to our Stat 101, it's probably one of the basic, for example, probability models, how we can integrate that within the, plug it in within the model. So there are multiple ways to do it. So one is within the model, or one is also we get the output of the model and putting them together. Just want to point out that the scope of our research was not to, for example, develop these models, was just to show, for example, what is the range of definitions of the community risk assessment, what are the elements, what are the conceptualization. But this is the observation that we have.
Right, thank you. This is a question that's coming from Matt Mason. He says, I am interested to know if you came across any good examples of where the top-down and bottom-up approaches were effectively integrated. If so, could you give your thoughts on how this was done?
I can give you some example. Again, I would repeat that I personally believe that the good example would not exist. There would be always a problem. The tension is inherent in this situation, in this scenario, and we can always improve, but we can never be perfect. And there would be always problems that are coming up. But again, one example that I have seen is that, for example, when you have the tables, when they are resourcing for the communities, they would seek different people around the table, and there would be representatives from the communities and representatives from the agencies who would provide their input for the table. And that way, the different people around the table would provide their information and integrate their information together.
Sara, thank you for introducing the SES Community Risk Assessment Framework. Where would it fit in terms of the top-down, bottom-up classification proposed by Nader?
I think we'd have to be honest and suggest that in its current conceptual state, it is a top-down, really, because we don't have that community input at the moment. I think what we would like to move towards is some form of combined approach where we're utilising the community both as a data source and an analysis point. But we're not doing that right now. We're very much still in the development stages of this work. And I should reflect as well that we have a huge amount of risk planning that has gone on in the agency for a very long time. This is not, our first foray into the concept. This is just a different approach, I guess, that we're trying to take in terms of pulling things all together and in how we're applying that and utilising that in our capability planning. So yeah, I think in answer to the question, it really, we'd have to admit, very much a top-down approach, because we're applying that concept from our perspective as an agency. What we're trying to do is place that community lens over it, to the extent that we can do that with our understanding of the community rather than our input from the community.
Great. Nader, I think you did answer this in the last question, but if you had anything else to add, there's a question: what's the best practical way that you would suggest to integrate that bottom up and top down in community risk management, especially for preparedness for events like bushfires and floods?
But what I can add to my previous answer is that I think people are key, and putting these people to talk to each other. So, for example, if an agency has a modeler, invest even in, for example, communicating those models to the community, so that the community looks at the model and understand what is the justification behind the decision. So investing in integrating these models through community engagement planning, involving people and letting people talk to each other, any type of basically social connection and socializing these practices would help in integrating.
Now, one question here, Nader, is about NERAG, National Emergency Risk Assessment Guidelines. Is it fit for purpose? Now, I know you did look at some of the literature around that, or did some interviews with people who had been working on that. Can you give any insights?
I think the observation we had was that it's a very good step, and some states, I think Tasmania has adapted NERAG for their own purpose, and they have. I don't remember exactly what they're calling it. I think they were calling it NERAG Plus or something of that nature, and so it's a good step. And again, similar to all the tools that are available, it's a matter of whether it's fitting the context that we are having or not. But I have not heard any specific problem with that.
The question has come in from Nikki Hansen, which is quite interesting. Are multi-agency scenarios with community involvement on your radar at the SES? I could see this being highly valuable.
Sounds like a good idea. Look, I'd be speaking out of turn if I was to say that we're certainly doing that. I think from a general perspective, so there are some other really good comments in there about the challenges of community engagement and repetition and fatigue, and I think that's something that we really have to consider. And I think that's to some extent what I was referring to in these conversations, the opportunity that we had through this work to have conversations with other agencies and other organisations. So not just within those, the SES or within those sort of emergency service type response agencies, but more broadly, there are so many different organisations and bodies and groups who are looking at impacts of various things on the community, and the community don't care. There's a saying that you hear a fair bit around, the community don't care what colour of uniform you're wearing as long as you're there to help them. And so I think we need to get a bit better at doing that and thinking about things from the community view. We're all desperately trying to help the community, but when we all turn up on subsequent days of the week asking the same questions, it's probably incredibly frustrating, and no wonder they get a little annoyed with us. So I think I don't have a good answer to the question. Yes, I think it's an absolutely great concept. I think the relationships are starting to work better. There's some really good engagement that I have seen just through working on this piece of work. at at AFAC level and at various other groups where these connections are made. And I think as long as we're all prepared to make that commitment and find those connections, that's the real challenge. Everybody's really willing to work together when they find the opportunity. It's being able to align our desires and our timings and our outputs so that we can actually put that community first if we're engaging with them. So yeah, in answer to theoretically, absolutely sounds like a great idea. In practice, not right now. Or not just yet. Let's go with not just yet.
Yeah. Okay, I have a question for you, Sara. You said, I'm paraphrasing you said that you got what you needed rather than what you thought you wanted at the beginning of the research process, and that you molded the work as you went along and you made learnings and connections to other agencies as you went along. And this was really music to my ears as someone who's trying, from an organization, we're all trying to champion and support co-designed research and partnered research processes. Can you reflect, I guess, on the time that you needed to commit to this? Because it's very different to the usual process of you get on with your day job and someone else does the research and then hands it to you. So I think that might be useful for other sort of sector partners out there around that sort of how you balance that time commitment.
Yeah, I think it's a piece of string question, to be fair. It depends really on what that work is involved in. I think for me, yes, it was time consuming because we would spend at least an hour or more on each interview. And as Nader said, we spoke to a lot of people. But it was worth the time to do that because it fed itself to do it in that kind of concentrated time frame, because it meant that we were following the those paths. As somebody would say, oh, have you spoken to so and so at this place, because they might be able to help you. So we were able to follow that through. I think so. Yes, there was time commitment, but I think in any situation, the reason you do research is so that you can learn something, and therefore you don't actually know what the answer is at the beginning, or you don't really need to do the research. So therefore, to be part of that and learn along the way, and to be able to mold that, within reason, to what you understand as you go is the real value in it, so that it's not just if you could go off and do this for me, that'd be lovely, because Nader would have done a great job and he would have come back and I would have said, well, that's nice, but actually, he might have just taken a top-down approach or a bottom-up. And what we were able to do was design the questions and the planning and the discussions, which were in themselves learnings for us as an agency, around the practical issues, limitations, and opportunities that we have here at New South Wales SES. So therefore, what I have to say about it is not going to necessarily be applicable even to the Victorian SES or one of the other state SES agencies, because we're all slightly different. We have different limitations and opportunities available to us. But there is some really broad applicability that is really useful in this program. And I think certainly being involved to that extent has paid off. While yes, there was a significant time commitment in that, it didn't need to be 47 people in a meeting for 3 hours every week, but it was just that, at least that one-on-one connection that particularly Nader and I had through that period of time. In saying that, it was, from my perspective, what did we have, Nader? A couple of weeks of interviews, really. We crammed them in over about probably, if you take the Christmas break out, probably about 4 weeks, 4 or 5 weeks of interviews, sometimes a couple in a day. So yeah, still managed to get some other stuff done in the meantime, but worth the effort, definitely.
Great.
Being conscious of time, I just want to quickly add from my point of view. I think this integration that we are talking about has to start from really at this curious stage of when we are understanding the problem. And in our world, we call it problematizing the context, which means that we are questioning all the assumptions of the problem. What is happening there? Why is it happening? And this is something that, as Sara was said, we could not do it alone. And it was through this discussion with Sara, and then with Sara with the other organization, that we tried to we were able to problematize the situation, really question the basic assumptions that we would have in this, and try to find the answer. So spending this time, which is one of the most valuable resources that we had, was, I think, I want to highlight what Sara said, is really necessary, and this would create, for example, the collaboration between the agencies in future scenarios.
Yeah, fantastic. I think we have time for one last question for Sara from Dale Domini House. One of the great challenges is rapid staff turnover in organisations like the SES and loss of knowledge and new staff relearning. I've seen this for 2 decades. How can the SES tackle that issue so learnings like this aren't lost with staff turnover?
The eternal question. Yeah, I don't have the answer for that. I tend to make a lot of noise in a lot of places, so I have talked to a lot of people across the agency about this. I have an opportunity within the program of work that I am delivering on, where I have connections across a whole lot of different teams in the agency, and so I have had a lot of those conversations with different people. So to some extent, that's sharing it. We're also working to get into doctrine, documentation, that sort of thing, where those learnings can be applied, and also in simply creating the structures that reinforce what we have learned. So if we're defining that, connection between agencies important, then let's set up those ongoing structures so that those agency connections are maintained, that it's not just well, here is the project, it gets filed once it's finished and we can move on. So I don't have the answer, unfortunately, Dale, but I think it's particularly about making sure that we're embedding those learnings into the outputs and the deliverables around not only the research, but then bringing that back into the agency as that partner and using it so that it's not just research for the sake of publishing. It is research that is really practically effective and useful.
Yep, that's great. All right, we'll hold the questions there. I'm going to hand over to Nader, who's got a plug for some postdoc positions, I think.
Yes, we have 2 postdoc positions in case you know anybody who is interested, who would be working on the broad topic of organizing for resilience at the University of Sydney. And the background can be very multidisciplinary, because again, the nature of the problems that we are studying are very multidisciplinary. So I have my emails there on the chat box. So if anybody knows anybody who's interested, that would be great.
Great, thank you. So I would like to thank Nader and Sara for their presentation today, and all the participants who took time to discuss the risk assessment process with them through their research journey. I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for tuning in today, for all your questions, and the recording will be online in the next week, and you will get an email when that is available. We've got plenty more events coming up online and in person. Natural Hazards Research Australia will have a booth at the AFAC 23 conference, so please come and chat with us if you're there. We'll have another Hazardous webinar in September. The topic is yet to be confirmed, so keep an eye on your socials. And if you're in Melbourne, keep the afternoon of October 12 free for our Disaster Challenge Final, where the teams will pitch their solutions for helping to solve the wicked problem of better linking disaster resilience resources to those in need across society. And registrations for that event will be opening soon. For updates on anything at NHRA, sign up to our newsletter, watch our socials. Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon and see you next time.